If you're an athlete and you believe your coach is more perfectionistic towards you and towards your teammates, you are more likely to experience burnout.
Hi everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the 80% Mental Podcast. I'm Dr. Pete Olsson, and I'm here with Leah Washington. Leah, how's things where you are?
Early.
Yeah,
that's how things are.
Time difference, isn't it? Sorry.
I woke up like 20 minutes ago. It's fine.
Sorry, but also you signed up for this, so, you know.
I fully did.
Well, this week we are talking about burnout, a topic which is close to my heart and my own sort of area of research interest. But we've got a brilliant guest to chat to us this week. And I want to welcome to the podcast Luke Olsson. Luke, welcome to 80% Mental.
Thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. And for those of you who don't know, Luke is a senior lecturer at LJMU, and his research interest is understanding the factors that underpin mental health problems and performance in athletes. His research primarily focuses on ascertaining the key reasons that make an athlete vulnerable to experience burnout, as well as quantifying how burnout can influence an athlete, including these health and performance consequences. So, Luke, like I say, welcome to the podcast. How did you get interested in burnout as a topic?
That's a really interesting question. I suppose, I don't really have a really cool story. I wish I did, but I don't. It kind of was born out of seeking out a PhD, and I ended up linking up with Professor Andrew Hill and Professor Daniel Madigan at Liverpool John Moores University. And the topic kind of interest that they focused on was perfectionism and burnout.
Mm-hmm.
And they were kind of wanting me to go in that kind of direction. And I was happy to do so. So I kind of undertook that role and undertook a PhD looking at kind of perfectionism and burnout, but more from a social perspective. So I suppose looking back, it was more just the encounters and the people I interacted with. But if I look back before that, and now that I know what burnout is, well, probably before I started my PhD, slim to little knowledge about burnout. But if I now look back, I think I definitely experienced burnout in my sport, when playing golf in university settings in America, and then probably a bit since that point. I've definitely had points that have been quite tricky in playing sport to a reasonably high level. I'd say reasonably liked. I never reached the upper echelons, but I got reasonably good.
Yeah. Whereabouts in America were you? I didn't realize you'd been you play golf over there.
Yeah, I was in Texas, so super hot, and super windy. But no, really good fun. I really enjoyed the experience. I was only 18 at the time, and I kind of did it. I jumped in the deep end, to play golf on scholarship out there, and then probably wasn't quite mature enough to stand on my own 2 feet and my own network. But looking back at it probably gave me the skills and the drive and motivation to probably work quite hard in my undergrad, my master's, and then my PhD, and has led me to this point now. So I never regret it. Although I never finished, but it was definitely a interesting experience compared to probably the UK.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to chat to you about burnout. Like I said at the top of the episode, it's a topic that I study as well, more from a coach perspective than an athlete perspective. So I'm really looking forward to kind of getting your insights on some of this stuff.
So, Luke, one of the things that we kind of use a lot of words interchangeably, and they often don't mean exactly right what we intend them to mean. And we talk about being stressed all the time, but burnout is a little bit different. So I wonder if you can kind of tease those two words apart for us.
Yeah, no problem at all. Jingle jangle fallacies all over the place in kind of psychology, and it probably kind of relates to stress and burnout as well. If I take the definition of stress, based on my understanding, kind of that state of worry and kind of mental tension, not necessarily a bad thing on a single day, but if that kind of continues over kind of a long period of time, it could become more problematic. And when we're kind of continually in a state of stress. Like we classify that maybe as chronic stress. And individuals will try to kind of cope and manage, to avoid further stress or further kind of issues. And one such way, according to theory at least, that people try to cope and mitigate further harm is to exhibit burnout, which could be kind of viewed as a psychological detachment from an activity, whether that be your workplace activity, your education activity, or in most of the research I do in sport. So I suppose to some extent, burnout is this response to chronic stress rather than being necessarily the same thing.
Cool. And,
I think people can kind of they think about they're just handling it, right? And they're just managing all the time. And then all of a sudden they fall apart and they don't realize how the chronicness of this stress it's unsustainable, right?
Yeah, it kind of creeps up on you. You won't probably necessarily be aware of it. And then suddenly you may become more aware, but may not know how to deal with that situation, especially if you're constantly faced with an environment or the way you're personally kind of wired, your kind of psychological characteristics. And that just kind of predisposes you to experience stress, in some way that you don't know how to deal with it because you're on your autopilot, and suddenly your body's way, or your brain's way of changing those things is to exhibit kind of burnout to kind of avoid, okay, well, I'm going to detach myself from this activity.
Yeah, so we could look at it as kind of a almost an adaptive response to ongoing stress. So we're kind of detaching ourselves from that stress by exhibiting those signs of burnout. But is that a sort of fair summary of what you're saying there, Luke?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
I'll probably use the word protection, but I think that kind of works really nicely summarized it.
So what then would you say are the kind of key symptoms? What does it look like? If anyone's wondering, am I experiencing burnout? What actually happens?
Yeah, so burnout is a syndrome, which is just a posh word for it's defined by its symptoms. And it's got 3 symptoms. Probably the one that readily comes to available in people's mind when you hear the word burnout is probably exhaustion. And in the case of sport, we look at kind of mental and physical exhaustion. And that's the idea that, let's take the emotional part, emotional exhaustion. And it's the idea that athletes feel emotionally exhausted from the continual stress of their sport participation. But we know that athletes perform, that they work hard physically. So there's kind of a physical exhaustion element to it. And that comes from the demands placed on them in that sport from a physical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's perceived emotional, physical exhaustion. Then we've got sport devaluation, this idea that athletes generally just do not care about their sport anymore. They just no longer see the value in their sport. They no longer enjoy their sport. So it's kind of almost like the mental tapping out of that activity.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final symptom is called reduced sense of accomplishment. And that's, I suppose, as it says on the tin, it's a perception that they no longer feel like they're accomplishing anything in their activity. And in this case, their sport. So those are the 3 kind of key symptoms, and hopefully a reasonably decent definition.
Yeah, it's funny because in the coaching research, we don't really talk so much about devaluation, the way you described it there. We talk about the cynicism instead. It's kind of similar though, isn't it? So it's a cynical attitude towards the work and towards perhaps relationships at work, and a cynical attitude to involvement in sport. So kind of similar terms, but ever so slightly different. But I guess that sort of exhaustion that you described there, people often talk about that in terms of just being, when you're just too tired to even make a simple decision, you get home, you just can't even decide what to have for dinner, so you just don't eat. It's that kind of level of kind of mental exhaustion. Is that kind of what you're talking about there?
Yeah, we're not just talking about fatigue, from just doing a single, either a run or a gym session or a training session. We're talking about kind of prolonged exhaustion from the mental and you are completely drained from your sport on a kind of quite a long-term basis, and not just a day-to-day basis, a more longer period of time. So, and it's usually, we try to kind of consider it irrespective of the training load you're undertaking, you are still feeling exhausted, both mentally and physically.
So we talk a lot about burnout. Burnout is pretty common in a lot of fields, not just athletes, but a lot of healthcare roles, like as athletic trainer, which is very similar to, for people in the UK, very similar to physiotherapist. There's tons of research on burnout in athletic training or in any medical profession, right? Teaching, anything that has like a high level of like emotional, requirements and emotional load, but also like there isn't a lot of time off, right? On these, like we're on call all the time or we're traveling all the time, so is burnout in these like helping professions or these professions where there's a lot of grind mentality, is this different in athletes or is it pretty similar?
I suppose there's two ways to answer that off the top of my head. Like, one is the kind of symptoms ever so slightly differ. So it's really hard to kind of compare burnout in teachers from medical and health practitioners to those of athletes, because we measure it slightly differently. As we said, we added this kind of physical exhaustion element to athletes. As Pete highlighted, depersonalization or cynicism is what we generally see in the kind of more occupational context, coaches and otherwise, whereas we have kind of sport devaluation for athletes. So there is no real kind of clear way to say, is it the same experience? We don't have a clinical cutoff for burnout. I would say that in most areas, but definitely in athletes, there is no clinical cutoff where someone is, in inverted commas, burns out. You are just experiencing more or higher or lower levels of burnout. That's not to say, though, that the environments are somewhat compatible, especially high-level sport, I would say, it's a stressful environment to be in. So is being a medical doctor, a surgeon, a teacher. All of those things are stressful environments and pressurizing environments to a large extent.
I want to kind of come back to that idea about environmental factors and influences and that kind of grind culture that you mentioned there, Leah. I want to come back to that in a little bit, but you mentioned it might be slightly different in athletes. Is there a link between overtraining, for example? Like could performance itself be related to like fueling and driving burnout in a way in athletes?
So I think I get this quite often, and it's an interesting question, and I will kind of confess that I'm not an overtraining expert, but I do believe it's kind of like a bit of a misconception that burnout and overtraining are the same thing. And it's probably propagated by media and athletes in the world that kind of understand that, this is what I think burnout is. And they may attach burnout to being this kind of physical thing, but kind of contrary to that kind of belief, burnout doesn't arise really from doing too much training. It's very much a psychological issue and has little to do with your training load, competing too often, seasons being too long necessarily. Whereas like from my very limited understanding of overtraining, it's more of a physical issue. Mm-hmm. And it's associated with doing too much training. It kind of manifests itself as a way of like a performance decrement. That's how you kind of spot it. So one, I suppose, is more kind of the physical side, and one takes care of more of the kind of mental side. But they are quite often seen as very similar things to those that maybe don't know too much about that.
Sure.
Well, I do think though that there is a Venn diagram where there's some overlap, right? Where somebody who's burned out and they have this like mental exhaustion, right? And they kind of perceive it as a way of like really trying to like push through. And I think the concept of like being overtrained is really difficult sometimes for like athletes to wrap their head around. Like, how could you possibly train too much? Mm-hmm. Right. And so they lean on this word burnout because that feels like it fits better, even though like on our side, we see them as like slightly different things. But I think the idea of like the word overtraining, I think is kind of, mysterious or like isn't real, I think, for athletes sometimes, even though that's absolutely what they are.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's like a sort of hair thin line as well, isn't there, between overtraining and kind of spilling over into, because overtraining is like, and again, the exercise physiologists can absolutely hammer me about this if they want to, but overtraining, as far as I can see, is kind of part of training, right? It's this deliberate overtraining in order to adapt and to get better and to get fitter. And so like overtraining is like a part of training, but then there's this sort of like hair thin line where it spills over into something that actually has performance decrements. But if you're constantly asking athletes to, push and, again, overtrain in order to elicit adaptation, then like that environment itself is going to be pretty conducive to burnout. I don't know if you'd agree with that, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think you make a really good point. And when I say like it has little to do with training load, you could argue that, well, if you're in a stressful environment and you're training more often, you're more likely to experience chronic stress and therefore burnout. Yes, training load could be a real like a distal predictor, but it's more the kind of effect of that environment is having on you, rather than necessarily the mere amount of training you're doing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense to me. Yeah, I mean, let's get into that then. Let's get into some of the causes. If you can kind of break it down for us a little bit, what would you say are the sort of the causes? Yes, it's a response to prolonged chronic stress, but what are some of the other factors that might lead to somebody experiencing burnout?
So if we're going to take the stress idea, like, because there are other lenses and other perspectives we could take, but if we take the stress idea, you could probably take a view that there's individual factors, personality factors that are maybe predispose people to experience more stress, see situations as more stressful and threatening. So let's take the idea of perfectionism, like you have excessively high standards, you're overly worried about making mistakes. When you're faced with competition or a hard training activity, you will find that environment tricky and stressful to be in. So that could be something that predisposes someone to stress. And then ultimately, that if that's kind of propagated over a continual period of time, you will likely experience burnout. But there are other individual factors, like at play that have been noted and been tied to burnout, not necessarily through stress, but obsessive passion, a lack of motivation, or even commitment type. How you committed you are to your sport and the way in which you're committed to your sport. Are you committed because you want to be there and you enjoy your sport? If you're entrapped in your sport and you have to be there and you've got no way out, potentially people have made that argument that could be conducive to experiencing high levels of burnout. But that's very much only really telling you half the picture, or even maybe less than half the picture. Because there are kind of social, like environmental factors that will inevitably be kind of stem from your stress, or your stress stems from them. So I do think there are very much social stressors that will come and lead to experiencing stress on a regular basis. And it is probably the interaction of the two, isn't it? The personality and the kind of social stresses that will make you more likely to experience stress over a continual period of time and ultimately burnout, I would argue.
It's really interesting that you've kind of brought up that this idea of some of these cultural factors and the culture of sport and the sport ethic and this kind of super macho, hyper masculine, borderline toxic masculinity of just kind of pushing through, and all these kind of buzzwords of resilience and grit and all that sort of stuff. And we're kind of seeing that seep outside of sport into our kind of society in general, right? There's this huge push towards like being productive, and you have to be working 18, 20 hours a day and like all of that sort of stuff, right? And I guess, leaving sport behind for a minute, what we're seeing is a lot of burnout in, non-athlete populations, and it's on the increase. And I'm just kind of wondering about the role of this, like I say, borderline toxic, not even borderline toxic, just actually toxic. Oh, Leah's dog just popped up. Hi, Leah's dog. Your dog didn't say hello, Leah. I'm disappointed. This kind of...
I've told him to be quiet for recording.
Oh, okay. He is the goodest dog. But yeah, I'm kind of interested just in this role of these cultural influences on how we're seeing burnout, like I said, in non-athlete populations. And how that's on the increase. I don't even really know what my question is. I just kind of want to talk about that a little bit. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on it.
Like, I think we're bordering into sociology here. But let's go for it. That's
good. Why not? Let's do a bit of sociology.
Like, I mean, could try. Like, I'm not so sure I'm a sociologist, but I'll give it a go. Like, so, yeah, I agree. I'm not sure if it's all environments are all toxic. Like, I think there are situations where people maybe view it as toxic, and there are also objectively environments that may be toxic as well. So I think if I take a slightly wider lens and kind of say, well, society might be becoming more like neoliberal, and we are being hyper competitive, and we are measured, marked against, ranked in so many ways from such a young early age, that everyone becomes almost hyper vigilant to those things and is trying to be the best. And standards to get into universities are getting only ever higher, and these kind of things. And we are assessing people on such a regular basis, both in maybe work, in education, but also sport. Like we see academy footballers now at like the ages of like 6 and 7, like in the UK. So, and we know that how kind of tricky it is to make it towards the end of an academy. So I think society probably has a role to play in creating kind of a stressful environment, like, and those kind of cultural things that are embedded in the way we live our lives potentially could be conducive to stress. Like, I think that's probably the best I've got from a sociological point of view. So, but yeah, for the neoliberal society, or a more neoliberal society, is maybe not helping matters with respect to burnout.
I think also there's a certain degree of like, we're better at recognizing it in other people than recognizing it in ourselves. Or for some reason, like, we think I'm the one who's different, like I can handle it. But like, if our friend was experiencing burnout, we would be like, oh, you should definitely take a break. You should definitely get help. But I don't need it. I'm fine. Right. And so I think there's a shift in like the just sort of like general culture of recognizing mental health disorders or mental health struggles. But I think we're still a ways away from recognizing it in ourselves and being able to say for ourselves, like, no, I need to take a break. I need to step away for a moment, where we wouldn't hesitate to do that, to advise somebody else to do that.
Leah, I've got a question for you, and it's kind of based on what you just said there about, like, I totally agree with you. I think we're much better at recognizing this in other people than we are ourselves. But again, I wonder how much of that is more a case of, well, actually, I do recognize that I'm burnt out. I do recognize that I'm emotionally exhausted and I'm kind of physically exhausted and I'm kind of not seeing the value in what I'm doing. I absolutely recognize that. But I'm in this kind of toxic culture and environment where actually what I'm doing is I'm just pretending that's not happening, and I'm masking my emotions, because this is kind of what we're finding in some of the coaching literature, right? That coaches
totally.
are masking emotions and kind of trying to be this superhero. So it's not that they're kind of not recognizing it, although there is a kind of degree of, you don't recognize it until you're actually like already there.
Right.
But it's more that I am recognizing that I'm struggling, but this environment is kind of one that doesn't allow me to be vulnerable, and it doesn't allow me to express my emotions openly. And I wonder, that in itself is kind of one of those drivers. I just wonder what you thought of, what you think of that.
Yeah, I think that's true. A lot of times, I think for individuals who like recognize that they're like, I can't keep doing this, there's a certain degree of like indispensability that we put on ourselves sometimes, where we think like, oh yeah, I'm totally burnt out and I definitely should get help, but like I can't because people need me, or because this team needs me, or because this organization will fall apart if I'm not there.
Yeah, it's right. It's just the superhero thing, right? Superhero complex,
right. And I think also, and I see this in my own consulting, where they know that they want to get help, but they don't want to go see a therapist. And so I'm often like the midway point, right? And so they'll see me because I'm a mental skills coach, right? And that's a safer place. Like, that's okay to go because it's mental skills, right? It's for my performance. And then like the more I talk to them, I'm like, yeah, like we need to do some emotional work. And I have found that the more that I consult, the more emotional intelligence kind of that I work on, that a lot of people have a really hard time even identifying what emotions they are experiencing, like in the moment. And so like their emotional vocabulary is very limited. And so I find that I've been like a stepping stone for a lot of athletes, because they know they need help. They don't really want to admit that they need help. So they kind of go to the most obvious thing to them, which is like, well, I'll just go seek help for my performance and then see if they can like kind of get around it. And then I'm like, no, these are your whole person comes with you. Like,
so you're basically like a gateway drug to actual therapy.
100%. And I'm totally fine with that.
This is the 80% Mental podcast. I'm here with Leah Washington and our guest Luke Olsson, and we are talking about burnout. If you are enjoying what you're listening to, then give us a follow on social media. We're on Twitter. Well, I don't know how much longer we'll be on Twitter for. if Elon stays in charge. At EPM Podcast. We're also on Instagram at 80% Mental. Or you can take a look at the website, 80percentmental.com. You can leave a comment. You can download all of our other wonderful episodes. Luke, we've kind of talked about what burnout is and some of the causes of burnout. We sort of talked around the symptoms a little bit earlier. I guess what I want to maybe get into a little bit more, just briefly, is what it really looks like, right? So, like, for anybody out there who thinks that they might be experiencing like burnout, like, yes, we talked about the symptoms of exhaustion and reduced accomplishment and this devaluation. What would an athlete be doing or saying or thinking, like, if they are in burnout?
That's a really good question. Like, one that I've not overly thought loads about. I think most of my research is kind of questionnaire based, so
sure,
I just kind of assess their burnout. But what would they be doing? They would be either not turning up to training because they don't care anymore, or they would be turning up to training but probably putting less effort into that training. Like, they may miss competitions, they may miss S&C sessions, whatever it might be. But even if they do turn up, their engagement is limited, let's say.
Yeah, so they might find themselves like withdrawing from activities, whether that's like literally or just kind of almost mentally withdrawing from what they're doing.
I think that's kind of a fair thing to say, or a likely proximal consequence of burnout.
Yeah.
And then if we're taking, let's take the sport devaluation, the kind of reduced sense of accomplishment. Both are very similar. One's just, I no longer care about my sport, and I no longer kind of see any kind of value in my performances. So regardless of how well they're performing necessarily in their sport, in training in their sport, you're probably going to see like a dulled emotional positive response. Like, they're not going to be as bothered about it. They might not celebrate as much their wins. They may get more agitated easier. I think some of those are the things that you may see in an individual. Like, although I think it's hard to see and go, that's burnout. Like, versus like, just someone's just a bit angry, they just had a bad day. Like, but if you're seeing that on a regular basis and you got in a more deeper conversation with them and you kind of put in a few things together, then I think it'd be easy to say that that's burnout. But it's a real interesting idea around the observational, can we observe burnout?
Yeah. I
would argue that definitely doesn't exist right now, like in the literature. But if we can kind of come to some form of area around that, it will be really interesting to kind of get into.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see kind of like, not necessarily that they, especially like if you're working with an elite athlete or a collegiate, higher level athlete, that they show up to practice and they'll go to practice because they know they'll get in trouble if they don't. But they might not do like a lot of the other things, like their recovery work, right? Or they might not, so they show up and they do the thing, but they won't do anything more than that when they typically would have. Or like I see, especially like at the beginning of a season, if they're not excited to be there, right? Like a lot of people get like really hyped about like, oh, it's like preseason, like getting the band back together. And like, they're like, here we go again. Like, we're back. And this is where I think it can be really difficult because we see a lot of like the behaviors, and there is a lot of overlap, right? Between burnout, between overtraining, between depression and all of those things. And that's where, like, when we see these behaviors or we see these, you hear these like spontaneous statements, like that's, the cue to be like, hey, maybe we should tease this out of like, what are we actually dealing with here?
Yeah, I think that overlap is a really important point to make at this point, that there is a real overlap between some of the symptoms or the outcomes perhaps of burnout and those symptoms of depression as well.
And there's a lot of comorbidity with that, right? And there's a lot of comorbidity with overtraining syndrome and depression, and some of that is really difficult to differentiate.
So just trying to sort of summarize and put this in, because you've kind of both given sport examples, which is fine because it's a sport podcast, but just to kind of try and put it in sort of non-sport in terms of talking about this idea of maybe withdrawing from activities. We're talking about maybe a lack of enthusiasm or kind of going through the motions, maybe doing the bare minimum just to kind of get by. Like, these are some of the things that you guys are talking about that might be indicative of someone who's experiencing burnout. Luke, I want to talk a little bit about your research, because we haven't really talked about that yet. But obviously you spent a long time looking into burnout. What's your research revealed about how we might understand or investigate or explore burnout?
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you. I think there's probably two sides to my kind of burnout research. One side is kind of like looking at the development of it, why it comes about, like why some individuals are experiencing high levels of burnout compared to other individuals. And the other side is kind of looking at the kind of consequences of burnout. But let's take the first side, the development of burnout. Most of my research through my PhD and afterwards has focused on kind of perfectionism being a key vulnerability factor that may lead individuals to experience burnout. And we see this across all, more or less most domains, occupational, educational, and in sports, and where the perfectionism, if you are more perfectionistic, you are more vulnerable to experiencing burnout symptoms. And when I say perfectionistic, I don't mean just someone that's got kind of high standards and sets kind of lofty goals. I'm talking about someone that sets like irrationally excessive high standards, like unobtainable standards. Someone that's overly worried about making mistakes. Someone that will react so negatively, even to something that doesn't seem that bad. Those individuals are more likely to experience burnout, and it's probably caused by that they're just experiencing stress on a continual basis. Living a life as someone that is highly perfectionistic is quite hard and taxing, and therefore burnout is probably just one of those outcomes that is likely attached to it. So that's some of my work. And athletes that are more perfectionistic, they experience probably more burnout. It's not a 100% guarantee. It's just the trend. And then we looked at kind of the social kind of factors attached to athlete burnout. And again, with a kind of perfectionism lens, we looked at how the coach, and their perfectionism, and if they outwardly project their perfectionism onto their athletes, does that have a role? And the answer is yes. If you're an athlete and you believe your coach is more perfectionistic, towards you and towards your teammates, you are more likely to experience burnout. And to some degree, more than your own perfectionistic tendencies. It can predict over and above.
Can I just ask, because we haven't actually done an episode on perfectionism, and I think we probably should, because it's a really interesting area to get into. But when you talk there about the coach's perfectionism having an impact on the athletes, are we talking about the coach's perfectionistic tendencies of their own, or their perfectionistic expectations of their team, their athletes?
Yeah, so it's outwardly projecting their perfectionistic tendencies onto their athletes. So there's, I won't go into too many details, but they're kind of broadly, there are seen to be three kind of forms of perfectionism, or dimensions of perfectionism. One, self-oriented perfectionism. I demand perfection for myself. The second one, which we're more talking about here about the coaches, is called other-orientated perfectionism. I demand perfection from other people. And the third one, which is also kind of usually attached to a lot of maladaptive outcomes, is called socially prescribed perfectionism. The idea that I believe others around me expect me to be perfect. So it's almost like an internalized pressure to be perfect. And again, whilst that's normally the one that's attached to a personal, an athlete, and that is tied to burnout, Whereas in a social perspective, it's the kind of the coach's outward projection, of their perfectionistic tendencies towards their athletes.
Yeah. They're the terms that I was looking for. I just literally couldn't remember them, so I didn't even bother trying.
Yeah, and I think there's often, like, I see a lot in my athletes a skewed perspective, right, where they assume that the coach expects them to be perfect when that may not necessarily be the case, and they're kind of like projecting their own perfectionistic tendencies onto like their perceived coach demands. I see a lot of like, I don't allow myself to make a mistake, but they'll kind of phrase it when they're talking to me of like, oh, the coach probably thinks this. And I'm like, that doesn't, to me, like, I know you're a coach and that doesn't sound like your coach. Like, I don't feel like that's probably true. And like kind of like going through of like almost like a Socratic questioning of like, okay, give me the evidence that would suggest this, right? Of like why your coach has this like demand of you, and kind of challenging that like idea of perfectionism as like projected onto other people.
Yeah, like how to describe this? I've done a study, not published, but it's part of my PhD. They pretty much explored this idea that like, is your perception of your coach, is it veridical? Is it objectively true? Or maybe I didn't quite do that, but I did something similar to it. And so I got the coach's perspective, I got the athlete's perspective, and then we looked at which one was influencing burnout. And you seem to find that they don't overly line up in terms of the coach and athlete's perspectives on, I think my coach expects me to be perfect and criticize me when I'm not, versus the coach saying, I expect others to be perfect and I expect that individual to be perfect. They don't normally line up. And when you look at the influence on burnout, it's not the coach's objective view that's relevant. It's always in the athlete's perception of that view, which is probably most of psychology, is it not? Like psychology is about the individual and how they experience the world, how they think, how they feel. So yeah, it's not necessarily always objectively true. Not say it isn't, like sometimes it is. But yeah, I agree. Athletes may have a slightly different perspective and maybe in some instances a warped view of what their coach says, but they might just pick up little subtle cues as a result of it. And their coach might be very well intended when they're trying to communicate to their athlete. They may say like, oh, you need to be better at this. Better athletes would do this. And you're trying to just be kind of like supportive and helpful. But some of those words might be internalized by an athlete to be like, oh, this is demanding. Like this is excessive and I've got to live up to these expectations and this is pressurizing for me. So I think neither is right nor wrong. We just need to acknowledge that how coaches say things can be sometimes misinterpreted by an athlete, and all well intentions don't always kind of work out. But athletes also should take accountability for like, have a conversation with the coach. Well, what do you mean by this? A conversation with a coach will probably resolve some of those kind of perspectives and some of those beliefs.
Well, and it kind of brings up this idea of this concept of psychological safety, right? That in a sport environment or in any kind of environment, really, how safe does that athlete feel to make a mistake or to try something new? And kind of, you mentioned before of like, am I afraid of making a mistake because I'm going to get called out on it? And our athletes kind of like almost get paralyzed by that, right? Or even like the safety of help seeking, right? Like, will they be called out for asking for help, or what is their perception? So I'm curious, what are the things that we can do to sort of ensure this idea of psychological safety, or to promote the idea, or to promote an environment that would minimize burnout?
Okay, I'm wading into waters that I'm not necessarily an expert in. Psychological safety, okay.
I'm just wondering if there are like some moderating factors or mediating factors to like, how can we maybe like make it less likely that someone would experience burnout?
Yeah, I think creating a psychologically safe environment is probably going to be conducive to being a protective factor to burnout. But there are other coaching factors, other environments that will be protective factors or vulnerability factors, providing more autonomy, supportive climates, providing a task-orientated climate, not making people compete in an ego-orientated climate, having good, close coach-athlete relationships. All of these things are probably going to help the situation, at least from a coaching perspective, in making burnout less likely. Doesn't mean to say it won't happen, because there are other factors, personal factors, even performance-based factors, that a coach may not be able to kind of mitigate or alleviate. But if we're creating an environment that is safe, providing opportunity for choice, like openness to kind of making mistakes, all of those things are going to be helpful and reduce the stress of that environment.
I'm really big on the idea of cultural change and cultural shifts and organizational responsibility for well-being of athletes and coaches and everybody else as well. So when I ask this question, it's with the caveat that actually organizations are responsible for a lot of this stuff. But are there things from the literature, are there ideas, from the research that might help individuals? And again, inside and outside of sport, but anything that might help individuals either prevent burnout or deal with burnout? Any sort of suggestions that you know of from the research?
Yeah, I think it's easy to blame the individual, as you said, and maybe the organization, wider society has a lot to answer for. But let's take those personal strategies. You could just take time away from that activity. If that activity is stressful and continually stressful to the point where you are now experiencing burnout, taking time away is not necessarily the world's worst idea. But is that just putting a plaster over the kind of issue? Because if you do so and you take time off work, but then you have to reintegrate back into that environment, and if that environment is still stressful, it's probably not going to really help the situation in your burnout long term. But it is a personal strategy to kind of tap out of that activity, to kind of put a little stop and plug straight away. I've seen
assuming that's possible as well, because obviously for a lot of people the opportunity to just kind of step away isn't really there. So I think that's important to say, you've got to make that decision. Can't make that decision lightly. There are many financial, social situations where that is not necessarily possible. So if we're going to take more than just kind of stopping the activity, there is a lot of literature around talking therapies. They potentially have benefit, but like I said, that's only really half the picture. Organizational, social interventions are really probably what are required and what are needed. Without them, we'll never really solve the issue. No, absolutely, yeah. No, I think you're right. I think it's a sticking plaster, but it's also important to acknowledge that there are things that individuals can do, even if what we actually require is broader social or organizational change. I think the other thing that I talk about as well is identity and how that's linked, and people developing identities outside of just themselves as an athlete or as a coach or whatever job that they're doing. And that kind of links with the acceptance commitment stuff, doesn't it, around sort of values outside of sport and making sure that people are taking care of those multiple aspects of their identity, as well as just themselves as an athlete.
Yeah, you see identity constriction being tied to athlete burnout. So if an athlete is very much, that is their sole identity. I am a high performance athlete. I'm an Olympic athlete, whatever it might be. And they don't really have any outside kind of endeavors and other identities, generally speaking. If that's not going very well in that activity, that's their sport, then potentially they are risk of experiencing burnout. If it's going well, maybe they're going to be all right still. But we know sport is not it doesn't always go well all the time. So I think it's being aware, as you said, creating multiple identities that allow you to take time away and step away from one of those identities and into another one, so it doesn't become this kind of pressure cooker of stress where you constantly are just in this environment and you think about it 24/7, 365 days of the year.
So this is the 80% Mental Podcast. I'm here with Leah Washington and Luke Olsson. We've been talking about burnout, what it is, how it manifests, what causes it, and then some of the things, just before the break we were talking about, some of the things we can maybe do to maybe mitigate burnout or even prevent it before it happens. If you are enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe at 80percentmental.com or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can follow us on social media as well. All the links in the description. Luke, it's that time of the podcast where we deviate from the questions that I said I was going to ask you, and we've got a little game that we like to play where we just get to know our guests a little bit more. So we've got you on as the burnout guy, all right, talking about your expertise and your research in burnout, but we want to get to know you, the person. Okay. Talking about multiple identities. We want to know you, the person. So are you happy to play our little game?
I only have a choice, but yeah, I'm happy to play.
Yeah. Informed consent and all that. You can right to withdraw anytime you want.
I'm happy to play.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've got 4 categories of questions for you. I'm going to ask you to pick an envelope between 1 and 4. Our categories these are our new categories, remember, Leah? And I've remembered what the 4th one is this time as well. So this or that, which is just either or, but with a fancy name. Favourites and firsts, hypotheticals, and perspectives. So I have 4 virtual envelopes, and I'm going to ask you to pick a number between 1 and 4, and we'll see what questions you get.
Let's go this or that.
Oh, no,
is that not an option?
No,
I'm
you got to pick a number. It's random.
Oh, okay, right. Apologies. Messing up the game already. Let's go with. I like the number 4.
Number 4. Okay, let's have a look.
Yeah.
Open up my virtual envelopes, and we've got favourites and firsts.
Okay, I can live with that.
Getting to know you. This is the game. Okay. All right, let's start easy. What was your first job?
Bartender.
Did you enjoy it?
I did it for a long time. Yeah. I don't know whether I enjoyed it or not, but no, I did meet my wife
did you?
doing the job. So
fantastic.
She was briefly my boss. So
perfect.
I would say, when it's busy, it's really good fun. Yeah. When it's too busy, it's horrible. When it's too quiet, it's not so fun either. But yeah, overall, I learned a lot from it.
Yeah. I worked in a shoe shop, my first job. I worked in Foot Locker. Best job I've ever had. I do it now. Leah, what about you? What was your first job?
Probably gymnastics coach.
Oh, okay.
Because I was there anyway.
Yeah, right. Okay. Favorite this time. Luke, favorite comfort food?
Pizza.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking I'd probably go pizza or maybe ice cream. Don't know. Leah?
But it is Hawaiian pizza, so it's a bit of like a...
No.
Controversial.
No.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be the pineapple guy, but I am that guy.
So one of my friends and colleagues, he's a nutritionist, and he just has a thing about pineapple on pizza, as in you would see people who put pineapple on pizza go to prison and be quite happy about that.
Just straight to jail.
Just straight to jail. Yeah, no questions. Just.
This is so yummy. I'm sorry to the Italian people that obviously really don't like pineapple on pizza, and it's a big no-no. But it just tastes so good, and it gives me a little zesty, tangy experience while also eating cheese, and tomato and bread. So it's just wonderful. But I understand it's a bit Marmite-y.
It's divisive.
Yeah, correct.
Leah, what's your go-to?
I'm a potato girl. Any kind of
potatoes.
Any form of potato as a comfort food. Mashed potatoes, tater tots, scalloped potatoes, you name it. That's what I want. I want starch, and salt, and in potato form.
Oh, okay. Luke, first album or CD you bought, and I'm kind of aging myself by talking about people still don't even buy CDs. First album.
Probably Queen's Greatest Hits.
Oh, solid choice.
So,
okay.
Not because I necessarily had a choice. more that my dad was really into Queen, Dire Straits, Fleetwood Mac, and the kind of and so he kind of bought in me. I listened to it. So many good songs on there. I don't listen to enough music anymore, if I'm honest. I'm more of a sporty individual, I would say, than I am an arts kind of individual. But yeah, that was my first album I think I ever wrote.
Yeah. Leah, do you remember yours?
I think mine, and this is again, I'm 1,000 years old. Madonna, True Blue.
Oh, okay. Very nice.
What's yours, Pete?
I was trying to remember this, and because I didn't have a CD player till I was like 17, so. But I think the first CD I bought might have been a Busta Rhymes CD. I think it was When Disaster Strikes.
Outstanding.
Yeah. It went rapidly downhill after that. Favorite cartoon character. You watch cartoons?
Not anymore. But I did in the past. Favorite ever cartoon. I like Taz. I don't know if that's the actual Taz Tasmanian was great. Tom and Jerry. So if you're gonna make me pick one,
classics.
Taz.
Classics.
Yeah. So apologies for anyone that is probably under the age of 18 and has no idea who Taz is. But yeah, Taz the Tasmanian. Get watching it. Amazing program.
I gotta go with I don't know. Did you guys have Calvin and Hobbes?
No.
I think that's a very American answer.
But that was like a cartoon strip, though, right? Rather than
yeah. That was in I was again 1,000 years old. Gem and the Holograms was another one in the United States.
We had that.
Yeah,
we had that. It wasn't for me.
It was an early one.
Yeah, I mean, you got to go with either Mysterious Cities of Gold or Ulysses. They were the two greatest cartoons ever made. I stand by that. They stand up today. Although I have started watching Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is amazing. It's amazing. And yes, I'm watching cartoons as a grown-up, and I don't care. First international trip, Luke.
Oh, I don't know. It's probably when I was really, really young. It's probably like somewhere to like the Canary Islands, but I don't remember it. But the first main trip I do remember going on was probably Portugal.
Yeah. Okay. Favorite subject at school.
So any given day it was different, but I really liked geography. I don't know
why I'm laughing at that.
It's all right, don't worry. I was good at PE. I was really good at PE, but I found it kind of I was always competing, so it's quite hard work. I went to a good school full of some good athletes that have come in the professional game. So I think, geography is kind of, I found it easier. I kind of understood it. I like the idea of human geography, and then also the kind of more physical side. I'm not saying it was the world's most enlightening of subjects and interesting, but I just kind of got it. And I think because I got it, I attached enjoyment to understanding it. Mm-hmm. So I think my performance was attached to my confidence in it and my enjoyment of that activity. Yeah.
I'm always so impressed when people are good at geography. I'm in this quiz league, and that is what the worst subject for me. You ask me about a river or a mountain, forget it. I have no idea where countries are. I have no idea, I can give you a general idea, but no.
Have you seen those where they get Americans to fill in maps of Europe? Have you seen that?
It's terrible. It's embarrassing, quite frankly. But also, you can't fill out the United States either. So
100% I could do it.
You could fill out all 50 states.
Yep.
Even all the square ones.
Yep, I could do it now. I'm an American sports fan.
That's fair.
So, I have an unfair advantage, I guess.
It's one of those things where I wish I was better at it, and I am not.
I'm kind of worried that you're going to ask me a capital city somewhere now. I ain't got a clue, and I'm going to just...
I wouldn't even know what question to ask you, so you're safe.
Good. Sounds great.
Okay. All right, last one then, Luke. What's the favorite thing about where you live? Although you're going to be moving, so...
Yeah, I'm literally moving. I'm going to be moving next week.
Yeah. What's your favorite thing about where you're going to?
Golf courses are near me.
Yeah, okay.
So I play golf still quite semi-competitively, and I'm going to one of the more, they call it the kind of Gulf Coast of England. So I'm moving within about a 2 or 3 mile radius of that.
Nice.
So that'll be kind of, my wife probably doesn't want to hear that. But that is probably the one unique selling point of why I chose that town versus all the other towns where I could have gone to. So yeah.
All right. Well, look, thank you so much for playing the Getting to Know You game. I've been doing it for about a year, still haven't got a name for it. Maybe we just call it the Getting to Know You game, but that seems a bit lame. But thank you for playing. I feel like I've got to know you a little bit better.
I appreciate that.
So this is the 80% Mental Podcast. I'm here with Leah Washington and Luke Olsson. I'm Dr. Pete Olushoga. We've been talking about burnout on this episode. If you have enjoyed it so far, don't forget to subscribe. Do that on the website, 80percentmental.com. And follow us on social media at EPM Podcast on Twitter or at 80percentmental on Instagram. Look, I've got a couple of final questions for you just before we finish things off today, if that's okay. So we've talked about quite a lot of stuff. We've kind of covered a lot of ground. And I just wonder, if there was somebody out there who's listening to this right now, whether they're an athlete or not, somebody who feels like they might be experiencing burnout, right, or approaching burnout in their own life. From your knowledge, your research, your understanding, what advice might you give that person?
First of all, I want to empathize with anyone that is experiencing kind of high levels of burnout. Like I don't think, whether that be in occupational or in a sporting setting, I don't think it's a real nice thing to experience. Like it's actually the complete opposite. So empathy with that. But then if I was going to go empathize and then also then provide some advice, I would probably ask or suggest that individual probably seeks out help where they can. And depending on what setting it is, the organization may be able to kind of set up that help, or you may seek out that help yourself. And it's speaking to someone that is probably professional and that is knowledgeable about this. So seeking out help will be my first suggestion. Because I don't think just kicking the can down the road and doing nothing about it, you will suddenly get better. I don't think that's going to happen easily. But say you don't seek out help, or you're not willing to seek out help, then as we said, the more drastic approach is probably consider not doing that activity. But I understand that may only work in some situations for some individuals.
Sure.
And it is quite a drastic strategy. I'm not advocating it for everyone to do so. Mm-hmm. And then it's hard to blame an organization, because the organizations will just go, well, no, that's a you problem, not an us problem. So you could probably vent about it, but I don't know how far most people would get in trying to change an organization, because really that's could be the crux of most problems, couldn't it? I speak to a lot of physios and other health practitioners from the NHS, and they say that nothing against the NHS, but it can be quite a stressful environment to be in, that maybe in some instances quite conducive to burnout. And arguably it's the organization and the environment they're in and the situation they're in that's kind of leading to that problem. So no matter of any form of CBT is probably going to really solve the problem. But I don't necessarily have the answer as to how you, unless you're in charge of the NHS and you think it's a big problem, you're not going to really create organizational change very easily. I think that's one of the biggest things to tackle in almost all kind of sectors. How do we genuinely create system-wide change to help individuals both perform well and also not experience mental health-based problems? I think that's kind of a really nice vision, but not necessarily something easy to execute.
And I think that also kind of raises the idea, if you're in a situation that is unchangeable, right, that you will have to develop coping strategies that help you manage that, right? That you aren't searching for and sort of shifting your expectations of this is what it is and it's not going to be any different. And the more I spin my wheels and trying to make it something different, the worse it's going to be, right? And I think I'm wondering, I can imagine how like just the idea of like choosing the appropriate coping skills for the context that you're in, would be a huge help, right? And even if you just seek help to learn coping skills, like that can be really powerful, I think, in those kinds of situations. I see a lot of times that dissatisfaction with the situation is furthered because they're trying the wrong coping skills, or there's a mismatch in coping skills, right? Between like what they are and are not. We talk a lot in sport of like control the controllables, right? And it's like, well, what actually do you have control over in this situation? And so to your point, Luke, about like, can you change the system? Probably not. So how do you function within a system that is unchangeable?
Yeah, coping is really interesting, isn't it? Like you could avoiding coping. That might work on a short term, and maybe that idea of, like, say, leaving the activity for a while, or at least pausing that activity. But that's not going to be a long-term solution. And problem-based coping, like trying to solve the problem. But if the problem is coming from an organization that's causing you stress, and you're not really able to solve that problem because you're not a decision maker of that, like, again, you find that problem-based coping is usually attached to kind of good things, but maybe if the problem is almost impossible to overcome, it could lead to bad things, like burnout being one of those. So emotional focused coping probably is the way to go down. Like if you're talking about burnout and trying to lower the likelihood of experiencing burnout, like I would say that's the one strategy that you could adopt in the kind of coping literature.
Final question then for you, Luke. What's next for you? What's next for your research on burnout? Are there any areas that are still underexplored or misunderstood? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, so I think I get the question a lot, like, what do we do about burnout? How do we try and prevent it from happening? And normally my kind of go-to answer is that, we'll just measure burnout on a regular basis. And if it's creeping up, maybe let's do something about it. But let's face it, we know someone is not going to administer a burnout questionnaire, and athletes aren't going to fill out a burnout questionnaire on a somewhat semi-regular basis. Like, that's just not going to happen. Like, I live kind of in the real world. Unless an organization really, really cares about burnout and burnout only, they're not going to start filling out loads of questionnaires all the time. And you still got to try and deal with it anyway. But through a PhD student of mine, we're kind of undertaking some work looking at less onerous markers or precursors potentially to experiencing higher levels of burnout that can be easily accessed and not require loads of money or tech that maybe a biomarker might be. Like biomarkers are great, but not everyone has the money to kind of assess blood or lactate or any other physiological marker. So we've looked at and are continuing to look at performance, like an almost kind of term in the idea of like performance slumps. If you experience performance slumps, are you more likely, is that a marker that leads you to experience burnout down the line? And we generally do seem to find that, not too surprising because performance is tied to stress as a stressor. When you experience poorer performance relative to your own kind of standards, you are more likely to experience stress. You are more likely to therefore experience burnout. And it seems to be particularly relevant for those that are perfectionistic. So if you're perfectionistic and you perform badly, you're more likely to experience more stress and more likely to experience burnout. So that's kind of the idea of having like a precursor marker to burnout. And it may signal like an early intervention, like, this person is performing not super well. I think we can't control our performance, but what we could do is we could look at how to change the kind of maladaptive response to poor performance and try and reset quicker, like to things we can't control. If we can kind of become more accepting and reset quicker, then potentially we kind of reduce the likelihood of at least performance-fueled burnout. So that's one kind of line of inquiry. And then my second line of inquiry that we're kind of looking into is the consequences of burnout. And we do seem to find across at least two sports, if the more burnt out you are, like in the week before you perform, the less likely you are to perform well relative to your previous ability. And also, we did a final kind of sample that looked at track and field athletes over a 3-month period. Like, what was their best performance in that 3-month period? And we find that burnout at the start of that 3-month period predicts a kind of like a dampened best like performance. And then Hannah Glandorf, like super good researcher at York John University doing a PhD, is also doing some research around health. Like, and we've just published some research there to look at the idea of like, oh, well, it has physical and mental health consequences as well. So when we marry the two together, it creates this kind of real narrative that maybe burnout is really important to consider moving forward, and we should probably do something about burnout and create more interventions, more robust interventions in the research, so we have a better evidence base to intervene on.
Awesome. Well, Luke, it's really, really good to hear that you are going to continue with your research, exploring burnout with some of your colleagues. But I guess the only thing that's left really to say is thank you so much, Luke, for taking the time to come on the 80% Mental podcast. It's been a really fascinating and insightful conversation into a topic that I think is really important, probably for quite a lot of people, actually. So thank you so much.
No, thank you very much for having me.
And thanks, as ever, to Leah Washington, who got up super early this morning to come on the podcast.
The things that I do, the sacrifices that I make. This toxic podcast that I'm on, forcing me to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning.
I mean, in fairness,
organizational stress.
I did say it's early. You don't have to do this one if you don't want to. And you're like, no, I'm going to be that.
No, but I'm a superhero.
So, okay. Indispensable. But yeah, I hope that you out there in listener land have enjoyed what you've heard today. It's been a really interesting conversation. We talked about all things burnout, what causes it, what it is, how it manifests, and importantly, some of the things that we can do both as individuals and maybe collectively as organizations, as a culture, to try and prevent some of this burnout. Don't forget to listen to all of our other episodes as well. There's some really good ones out there. You have to take my word for it, at 80percentmental.com, or you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media at EPM Podcast on Twitter, at 80percentmental on Instagram. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed what you're listening to. I hope you've I get right to the end and then fuck it up. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time. Although we won't see you though, will we?
You won't see us.
Because it's a podcast.